So then, as I was saying, that is the epoch that is coming to its closure here, Derrida says, but not its end, because he's still using some of the verbiage, some of the discourse, the words within that tradition, the signifiers within that tradition, and some of the signifieds as well. He's still using them, such as theology and grammatology, in order to construct a system that he's going to use as a tool to deconstruct this earlier system. And so the beginning of writing, then, will be the beginning of restoring a certain degree of privilege to writing, and it will be a writing that is divorced from subordination to the logos, divorced from the voice and subordination to the voice. It'll be a new kind of writing, a writing in which that will be governed more by the play of différance than by a logocentric idea like being. So that's what he means. And then he starts this section by quoting Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, Socrates, he who does not write. And so we recall from Plato's Pharmacy the whole idea about the pharmakon. Socrates, or rather Plato, saying that writing is the pharmakon, which is both the cure, but it's also the poison. Writing is, there's a basic ambivalence toward writing in Plato, although he definitely sides against it even while using it to write the Gospels more or less of a man who eschewed writing and never left writings, but nonetheless had to die by taking pharmakon, by taking a poison that killed him. And so Plato plays around with all this, and Derrida plays around with Plato's play. And Nietzsche, we all know about what Nietzsche said about Socrates as being the avatar of the intellect that begins the deconstruction process actually within the Athenian tradition. Socrates is the intellect that comes along and starts to dismantle all the great traditions, especially the religious ones, by questioning everything. So it's interesting that he invokes Socrates here right at the start of this. And then he moves into a section called the program, where he talks about, he uses a lot of, note that on page 8, he uses a lot of eschatological terminology, and eschatological terminology is also a terminology that belongs to the metaphysical logocentric tradition. You have archai for first principles, like Genesis and ousia, and substance and soul, and you have eschatological terms, like parousia, or the end of time, the end of the world, to indicate its ending. And he talks in here about how we're moving into the death of the civilization of the book. And this death of the book also undoubtedly announces nothing but a death of speech, the so-called full speech. And by speech here, he means that the thing about the logocentric tradition is that speech is preferred over writing, because speech is aligned with the voice, which has immediate access to the metaphysics of presence of the subject. It's the most immediate medium, as it were, of signifiers that refer to mental concepts. And the mentality is itself being. It's immediately aligned with being, and the voice is the direct utterance of being through the subject in terms of the first medium, voice. Writing, then, is a representation of a representation. Namely, writing is secondary because it represents speech and transfers it to a page, and so it's twice removed from being, from the logos. Speech is fundamental in the logocentric tradition. It's phonocentric. Speech provides the immediate access to being because it provides immediate interiority, immediate access to the self, which is then also rooted in being. And then there's another section on the signifier in truth, where he talks about how what the situation that we find ourselves in now with deconstruction is the absence of a transcendental signified. The transcendental signified is the logos idea, as I have said, that guaranteed and made possible statements of truth insofar as we can utter them that are measured up against the transcendental signified, whether that's phusis or whether it's God, whether it's logos, whatever happens to be. They're all transcendental signifieds, ultimate terms that anchor the truth statements of the signifiers that refer to the signifieds. And so in a certain sense, the signifieds are in between the two. The signifieds have an immediate relationship with the transcendental signified, but they have a mediated relationship to the signifiers, which are, of course, writing. And so this also upholds the metaphysical opposition between the sensible and the intelligible that Derrida is trying to deconstruct here. He's trying to pull apart all the metaphysical oppositions to show that they aren't quite as rigid as these philosophers want you to believe that they are. The intelligible is identified with the signifieds, that is to say with the concepts. The signifieds are the concepts That's the intelligible realm, the privileged realm. Writing is exterior to the self because it's on the outside. It's associated with the senses. It has to be seen. It has to be read, and it is not aligned with the voice. It's pure exteriority, and so it's made up of signifiers. And so the signifiers are the sensible aspect of the tradition, the sensory aspect, and the signifieds that they refer to, the concepts, are the intelligible aspect. And this idea of deprivileging writing, of seeing it as something that is exterior to the interior dynamics of the logocentric tradition, is what he's trying to pull apart and deconstruct here, to reverse in a certain sense. And then he moves into, he also talks about how there is within this tradition a good and a bad form of writing, and he says that the good form of writing is actually metaphorical, and it is the writing that is in the soul, that is pre-printed as it were in the soul, and it's also the writing that's in the book of nature. As Galileo says, the language of nature is written in the language of mathematics. The idea of the cosmos as a giant book. This is the type of writing that's privileged in this tradition, whereas the bad writing is the actual writing, the literal writing, the actual printed words on the page. That's the bad writing because it's secondary, it's artificial, it's a supplement, it's exterior, it's identified with the senses, it's not identified with the intelligible realm. So there are these two types of writing in this tradition. And this section then concludes with a section called the written being and the being written. And in this section he brings in Heidegger, and he talks about Heidegger's idea of being that supported this idea of these signifiers referring to ultimate signifieds that are in turn anchored in a transcendental signified. And he says that one of the things that Heidegger did with being is that he crosses it out. In some of his texts, he takes the word being and he writes it, but he draws an X through it in order to indicate that being as a transcendental signified is no longer there. We are living in an epoch, according to Heidegger, in which beings have been abandoned by being, but yet it has left its trace. And so the legible word being that you can see underneath the cross strokes is the trace that was once occupied by the transcendental signified of being that's no longer there. And in the absence of that, being idea, all we have left is the trace of being, the footprints of being, that are like the footprints that the Buddha leaves behind. You can't represent in early Buddhist art, Indian Buddhist art, you can't represent the Buddha because he's gone, he's attained nirvana. Instead you can leave his traces behind in the form of a footprint perhaps, or a lotus flower that indicates that he was there but he's gone now. And so it's something similar to that, the way that Heidegger crosses out being to indicate that that metaphysical age has been effaced, being has been occluded and forgotten, and it is no longer effective in grounding truth in the modern age. And so Derrida's concept of différance is similar to Heidegger's being idea, since Heidegger's being idea is that ultimate metaphysical principle in the past which made intelligibility as such possible. Any kind of truth statement within an age is guaranteed by the being idea of that age. But that is gone now, and so what's left behind is the trace. And of course Derrida's trace is the différance. Différance is the anti-metaphysical principle of generating pairs of opposites in the metaphysical tradition that make signification possible through the play of pairs of opposites. So it's this kind of term that refers to the generation of pairs of opposites, which is itself a trace. And it corresponds loosely, it's homologous. It's not the same thing as the being idea, but it is somewhat Derrida's equivalent of the being idea, except that it's being absent its center. There's an absent center. There's a center missing now, and because of the absence of that center, now we can have the play of signifiers that are no longer fixed. It's no longer inscribed in stone, as it were, because the meanings now can shift, as they do, for example, in a text like Joseph Finnegan's Wake, where the meanings of the words are like traces that are constantly shifting because words have been put together in such a way that there are multiple words within words, and they're constantly shifting their signification. Although in Joyce it's a little different because he is in a modernist age where meaning is still linked with the mythical tradition, and so it isn't an absent center in Joyce in the way that it is in Derrida's différance. So différance is the play of both difference that generates these pairs of opposites in space, and also the temporal aspect of deferring these meanings, deferring them in terms of time. So it's a spatio-temporal idea, but it's a sort of anti-metaphysical, metaphysical idea, différence. And Derrida himself will occasionally cross out the word is, or certain words of his language, in order to indicate the effacing, his attempt to efface and neutralize the metaphysics of presence. Is a being word that indicates presence, and by crossing it out, he indicates his effacing of the metaphysics of presence. And so the word was originally the elementary and undecomposable unity of the signified and the voice. The voice was bound together with the signified, and the word was its immediate expression in the logocentric tradition that Derrida is trying to shift us out of now, moving into an epoch in which a new kind of writing, a writing that is not bound in terms of its meanings and controlled by a transcendental signified. That's gone now, so we can do whatever we want with the play of these signifiers, because all that we have left now are traces, and the traces have so many different meanings as they slide across planes of signification that we end up with a play, a continual deferment of meaning within text, so that in the absence of the ontological center, all we have left is the text itself as its own center. There is nothing outside it anymore that sort of supports it. And so that then, in a nutshell, is the opening chapter of Grammatology, on the end of the book and the beginning of writing.